Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final edition of the Simpson Faculty Showcase. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maeve Callan, Professor of Religion. Maeve, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Andy, for that introduction, for everything you've done to organize this series. And thanks to all who are joining me on the last day before a holiday break, a holiday with direct relevance for the topic at hand. As I say during the course of the talk, the imperialist colonialism that the English imposed on Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, they forced on their neighbors first. So let's consider how that came to be. I recognize that medieval history can feel a bit foreign, so I'll stop for questions after I cover the basics, so feel free and encouraged to use the Q&A box for that purpose. And then I'll stop again after a crucial point about the invention of whiteness. So, in Casualty, Seamus Heaney laments the death of his friend, Lewis O'Neill, killed by the Irish Republican Army. A Roman Catholic, like so many of the IRA themselves, Lewis was the only casualty in this attack on the Roman Catholic-owned Imperial Bar, evidently because the IRA had ordered a strict curfew to be observed on the day of the funerals of the victims of Bloody Sunday, when British soldiers opened fire on a civil rights protest in Derry. An alcoholic who, quote, would drink by himself, end quote, according to the first line of the poem, Lewis was also a fisherman whose whole manner Heaney loved, and who was blown to bits out drinking in a curfew. Others obeyed 3 nights after they shot dead the 13 men in Derry. Heaney later asks,
how culpable was he that last night when he broke our tribe's complicity? Now you're supposed to be an educated man, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one.
Like Lewis, Heaney breaks our tribe's complicity in mourning his friend's death, calling out all who enabled the IRA to have the power it had, even over life itself. The guilt isn't Lewis's. Rather, it belongs to all who allow such systems to take root and fester. This doesn't excuse or minimize the state-sanctioned shooting of 27 boys and men and 1 woman, killing 13 as they peacefully protested against injustice and oppression. Far greater blame, responsibility, and accountability must belong to those who actually pulled the trigger and those in power who gave them license to do so. But as we repeatedly emphasize in Simpson's MVP trainings, it's on all of us to recognize our own complicity in enabling such systems, as well as the areas in which we have greater agency to prevent crimes from happening. Northern Ireland doesn't make the US news the way it did back in the 1970s or even 90s, but Americans who are aware of the violence there often reduce it to religious difference, Catholics against Protestants, though few seem to recognize that the so-called Protestants are at minimum 2 distinct denominations: the Anglican Church of Ireland, an offshoot of the Church of England, or what in the United States we call Episcopalians, reflecting the English colonization of Ireland that began in the 12th century. And the Presbyterians, originating with Scottish lowlanders who took territory that James I offered in the plantation of Ulster. This followed the flight of the Earls, when key Irish nobles fled Ireland in 1607 after their decisive military defeat by the English, marking the end of an even semi-independent Ireland until the 20th century. Even less known is that until the 12th century, Scot primarily referred to an Irish person, including those of Dalriada, an early medieval Ulster kingdom in northeastern Ireland that also encompassed Western Scotland. The Irish heavily influenced medieval Scotland in multiple ways, including monastic missionaries who helped spread Christianity throughout not only Scotland, but Britain more broadly. Yet James declared that the plantation of Ulster would establish the true religion of Christ among men hitherto depraved and almost lost in superstition. A 17th century Protestant king's claim that Catholicism didn't count as Christianity is hardly surprising, but 6 centuries earlier, the Norman conquest of England in 1066 was partly predicated on claims that the English had lost their Christian identity and William of Normandy would help restore the church there, despite all involved being Catholics. Moreover, the Normans were relatively recent converts to the faith, adopting it only the previous century as part of the terms for their settlement in what became known as Normandy in France, after centuries of raiding Catholic communities throughout Britain, Ireland, and the continental coast, as the hated heathen Norsemen the Vikings, who massacred monastic communities and enslaved survivors. The English, descendants of Germanic tribes that invaded England starting in the 5th century, had been Catholics since the 7th century, thanks in large part to Irish missionaries. Yet in the 11th century, their Christian identity was proclaimed at least partly lost to help justify William's conquest. This dynamic was even more pronounced the following century, when those Norman conquerors' descendants set their sights on Ireland, which became the first Western European land outside of the Roman Empire to adopt Christianity, specifically Catholicism, in the 5th century. William's great-grandson, Henry II's vassals, invaded Ireland starting in 1169, and he joined them a little over a year later, partly to avoid the fallout for his role in assassinating his archbishop, Thomas Becket, in Canterbury Cathedral. Martyring your archbishop normally would disqualify you from any claim to be a Christian savior, yet in 1172, Pope Alexander III pronounced him precisely that, praising him as so devout a son of the church, a most Catholic and Christian prince, who, stirred by divine inspiration, had subjected to his dominion that people, a barbarous one, uncivilized and ignorant of divine law, that is, the Irish. Alexander wrote this to his own papal legate in Ireland and its 4 archbishops, all Irishmen, all representatives of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and all Catholic Christians. In an irony that accentuates the emptiness of his imputations of Irish apostasy, the Pope's Latinization of 2 of their names were Catholic and Christian. A third was Lorcan O'Toole, Archbishop of Dublin, soon to be a canonized Catholic saint. Alexander's letter to Henry continues in a similar vein, exalting Henry's alleged virtues and excoriating the Irish for their alleged vices, claiming Henry's role as the religious savior would win him an eternal crown, and presenting his conquest of Ireland as penance for his sins. The letter doesn't mention that those included inciting an archbishop's martyrdom in his own cathedral less than 2 years earlier. The Irish, on the other hand, Alexander alleged had exchanged Christianity for unspecified, quote, monstrous abuses, end quote. Yet the only religious failings his letters cite, occasionally eating meat in Lent and not paying tithes nor sufficiently respecting the religious, are inherently Christian transgressions that pale beside those committed by Henry and his men before, during, and after their arrival in Ireland. In his 3rd letter on the matter to Irish secular rulers, Alexander softened his anti-Irish rhetoric, yet similarly proclaimed that the Irish, quote, have fallen away so far from the divine law, so they shall be all the more surely molded in it and receive all the more fully the discipline of the Christian faith, end quote, through Henry's dominion. Alexander's harsh words shouldn't be assumed to accurately indicate his estimation of the Irish. Rather, they reflect a military and political fait accompli that he exploited as part of larger strategies involving Henry, whose support he needed in his own contest with the rival claimant to the papal throne, as well as in the Crusades, as Jerusalem grew nearer to slipping away from Catholics forever, and as Henry had promised exorbitant donations from all his lands as part of his penance for Becket's murder. In the 14th century, as the Irish were winning back more and more of their land, reducing English control to about 1/3 of the island, which you can see in the stripy red parts here, English colonists echoed Alexander's sentiments in a request to his successor, Pope John XXII, to call a crusade to complete Ireland's conquest, claiming the Irish, quote, a savage and sacrilegious race hostile to God and humanity, end quote. John, however, was unmoved by their plea and advised that Ireland's governance be left to what he saw as the island's 2 ethnicities, quote, pure Irish and those of a mixed race, end quote, meaning English colonists, now commonly called the Anglo-Irish. The imperialist colonialism that the English imposed on Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, they forced on their neighbors first, where physical characteristics couldn't provide as convenient an excuse. Instead, they made religion the pretext for their racism, even though all involved were Catholics, and the Irish had been since long before their colonizers' conversion. Now, since that is the basic historical overview that I want to make sure people are clear on, so are there any questions? Anything I should clarify? Not seeing any, I will continue on. Racism may seem an anachronistic characterization, given the view that race emerged only in modernity as a system of categorizing peoples based on genetically inherited physical differences. Yet increasingly, scholars not only recognize earlier systems that insisted upon rigid hierarchical human divides as racist, but they argue that doing so is essential for addressing racism today. As Geraldine Hang notes in The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, not to use the term race would be to sustain the reproduction of a certain kind of past while keeping the door shut to tools, analyses, and resources that can name the past differently. The refusal of race destigmatizes the impact and consequences of certain laws, acts, practices, and institutions in the medieval period, so that we cannot name them for what they are, and makes it impossible to bear adequate witness to the full meaning of the manifestations and phenomena they install. A reissuing of the medieval past in ways that admit the ongoing interplay of that past with the present can therefore only recalibrate the urgencies of the present with greater precision. The ways in which modern white supremacists appropriate the medieval European past to fuel their hate makes recognition of these truths among medievalists, in particular, all the more urgent. In Sierra Lamuto's words, medievalists need to build our racial consciousness. We need to understand that race is not synonymous with ethnicity or culture, nor does it exclusively belong to a scientific discourse that postdates our pre-modern period of study. It does not begin and end with skin color or biological markers of difference. Race is a structural mode of codifying difference into an ideological system. It is malleable because its constitutive parts are themselves malleable. When white nationalists turned to the Middle Ages to find a heritage for whiteness, to seek validation for their claims of white supremacy, and they did not find resistance from the scholars of that past. When this quest is celebrated and given space within our academic community, our complacency becomes complicity. We have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the knowledge we create and disseminate about the medieval past is not weaponized against people of color and marginalized communities in our own contemporary world. Perhaps the clearest medieval analog to modern racism is Christians' racializing and persecution of Jews, including Spain's infamous limpieza de sangre laws that, starting in the 15th century, classified Christian conversos and their descendants as inherently biologically inferior to so-called Christians by nature due to their Jewish or Muslim ancestry. In the words of the University of Chicago's David Nuremberg, the possession of any amount of such blood made one liable to heresy and moral corruption, and therefore any descendant of Jews and Muslims, no matter how distant, should be barred from church and secular office, from any number of guilds and professions, and especially from marrying old Christians. Such racist rhetoric obscures Christianity's Jewish origins, with Jesus, Mary, and the apostles themselves Jews, and ignores the fact that ultimately all Christians descend from converts if they're not converts themselves, with Jews far closer to the source than Spanish pagans would be. The near millennium and a half since Christianity developed out of Judaism may have made such truths easier to disregard, but dominant Christians' tendency to deny their contemporaries the rightful religious identity occurred in multiple contexts and increased significantly around the turn of the 13th century, when crusades began to be used against European Christians. Pope Urban II first called a crusade in 1095, urging Catholics to wrest the Holy Land from Muslims, but Middle Eastern Muslims weren't crusaders' only targets. They repeatedly attacked Western European Jews en route and also turned their violence against Byzantine Christians, who would today be classified as Eastern or Greek Orthodox Christians, one of the three main branches of Christianity, the other two being Catholics and Protestants, the latter emerging only after the Middle Ages. Catholics sacked Byzantium's capital of Constantinople in 1204 and established a Catholic colony there that lasted until 1261. Crusaders also held Jerusalem for less than a century, from 1099 to 1187, and Western European Christians interpreted its loss as God's judgment upon them, especially for allowing deviance among them. They thus applied crusading ideology against various internal others, including certain Catholics. Such rhetoric wasn't explicitly applied to Ireland until the 14th century, But Pope Alexander's eagerness for Henry to at last fulfill his repeated vow to go on crusade helped prompt him to endorse the English colonization of Ireland in 1172. This colonization's main propagandist, Gerald of Wales, whose family fortunes incalculably increased because of it, saw its similarities with crusades in the wake of Jerusalem's loss in 1187, but also condemned Henry for fighting Christians in Ireland when he should have gone on genuine crusade to save Jerusalem from Muslims. Amid the Crusades' failures, Western European Christians desperately sought assurance of God's preferential love for them and found it in an imagined white identity. Starting in the 13th century, they replaced pinkish-brown hues with whiteness in their artistic self-representations, striving to make their skin more closely resemble the radiant light and purity associated with holiness and divinity as they wrestled with their defeats at darker Muslim hands, building upon centuries of colorism in Christianity that associated darkness with sin, death, and evil. Excuse me. The late 13th or early 14th century Middle English poem, King of Tars, makes the dynamic explicit. Christian baptism transforms the lifeless, monstrous offspring of a Christian princess and the Sultan of Damascus, turning a gray lump of flesh that lacks limb, blood, and bone, with neither nose nor eye, into the fairest child ever born. His Muslim father, awed by the miracle, accepts Christianity and baptism for himself, and in modern English translation, his skin that was black and hateful became all white through God's grace. Religion here blends into the biology that would become so central in European racism towards other peoples. A so-called race science later filtered biology through bigotry with its pseudo-scientific claims that each race, classified largely by skin color, descended from separate ancestors and was incapable of creating fertile offspring with other races, despite ample evidence to the contrary. So too could medieval religious belonging hinge on the prejudices of the powerful rather than reality. As shown when the Irish were rendered no longer Christian so their land could be colonized, the century before Europeans proclaimed themselves white to distinguish themselves from darker-skinned Muslims who had beaten them in holy war. And as this is such a key point that European whiteness is an invented identity, a response specifically to European Catholic anguish about losing their self-proclaimed holy war to darker-skinned Muslims, to console themselves that God still loved them best, I wanted to stop again to see if there are any questions. Again, I'm not seeing any, so I will continue. As Lomuto notes, race is inherently malleable because its constitutive parts are themselves malleable. In certain contexts, skin color and other inherited physical features may be the most decisive factors in categorizing difference. In others, it may be language and geographical location, and in others, religious identity. Ethnicity, race's cousin, reflects more of a group's self-perception than race's external imposition, but both are selective constructs. Ethnicity is a given group's situational and strategic sense of its own identity, shaped by its culture, language, ancestry, and location, among other factors, and defined in opposition to those seen as dangerously different, a threat to be eliminated, subdued, or avoided. Religion reinforces both race and ethnicity, but as the artificial distinctions imposed by limpieza de sangre and the denial of Irish Christianity to serve imperialist ends indicate, bigotry and bias could trump truth. The fierceness with which many white Americans, even today, insist on an Anglo-Saxon identity with virtually no basis illustrates ethnicity's ambiguity and self-constructed nature. For example, on July 16th, 2019, as the House of Representatives prepared to vote, quote, to condemn President Trump's racist tweets about 4 female Democratic lawmakers of color, end quote, as this article says, Republican Congressman Mike Kelly declared, "We're going beyond the pale right now. They talk about people of color. I'm a person of color. I'm white. I'm an Anglo-Saxon." When asked if he had ever been told to go back where he came from, as Trump's tweets suggested the 4 congresswomen should do, and as Trump supporters would repeatedly chant sent her back at a rally the following night in reference to Representative Ilhan Omar, the only immigrant among the 4 congresswomen, Kelly replied, "Yeah, they have actually. With a name like Mike Kelly, you can't be from any place but Ireland." Actually, you can be from any number of places, including Pittsburgh, where Kelly was born, as were his parents. At least 3 of his grandparents were also born in Pennsylvania. To go back to Ireland, you'd have to go back into the 19th century, amid the massive immigration resulting from the potato famine and its mismanagement by those with far greater but still weak claim to Anglo-Saxon, that is, the English. And more specifically, quote, those who governed in London at the time, end quote, as Prime Minister Tony Blair acknowledged in an apology in 1997. To refer to someone from England, let alone someone from Ireland or Pittsburgh, as Anglo-Saxon, a term for Germanic tribes who established a series of kingdoms in the 6th and subsequent centuries, which became unified as England only in 927 and was conquered by the Normans in 1066, is ridiculously anachronistic in the 21st century and would be even in the 12th, when Ireland's colonization by the English began. Kelly's most obvious fallacy here is that white people are people of color, but his perception of himself as Anglo-Saxon because he is from Ireland illustrates how pervasive that colonization has been, as does his suggestion that condemning racism goes beyond the Pale. The Pale refers to an area encircling Dublin from Dundalk to Dalkey, to which the English colony in Ireland had been effectively reduced by the 15th century, and is thought to be the source of the expression beyond the Pale, as the English regarded everything outside of the Pale as uncivilized, since it was dominated by the native Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Irish colonists who had assimilated so thoroughly into Irish culture as to seem indistinguishable, at least according to policies restricting colonial acculturation, like the 1366 Statute of Kilkenny. Problematic as virtually every word Kelly uttered in this exchange may be, he is far from alone. Anglo-Saxon often gets used to describe white people in general, even as it has been used repeatedly to exclude certain European ethnicities, including the Irish, from an invented white identity. As the University of Minnesota's David Perry notes, this concept of Anglo-Saxon emerged among 18th and 19th century Brits who fabricated a pure white race, quote, on their isolated, splendid island, end quote, and was especially embraced by wealthy white Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's often tied to Protestantism as well, as in WASP, meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Representative Kelly is Catholic, but in the United States, the Protestant aspect diminished somewhat after John F. Kennedy's presidency, and even more substantially with the rise of religious nuns, so-called because when asked the religious affiliation by pollsters, they answer none, that's N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. As of 2019, nuns outnumber Catholics in the United States at 26 to 20%, while all Protestants combined stand at 43%. The number of Catholics, Protestants, and Christians generally have been declining in the United States, while nuns have been one of America's fastest growing religious demographics since the 1990s. Yet while institutional religion may be lessening in importance among Americans generally, religious and racial bigotry continue to have outsized influence. The FBI lists religion as the second greatest factor in recognized hate crimes, which are notoriously undercounted, with 21.4% attributed to religious bias, as opposed to 55.8% to racial or ethnic bigotry and 16.8% to sexual orientation bias. Kelly offered his ethnic musings amid rampant distortions of medieval European history, which advance a white supremacist agenda and have fed a staggering increase in right-wing violence, especially in the United States. According to the Anti-Defamation League's report on murder and extremism in the United States in 2018, every single extremist killing from Pittsburgh to Parkland had a link to right-wing extremism. 2019 saw fewer such casualties from such causes, with 38 of its 42 extremist murders arising from right-wing ideology, as opposed to all of 2018's 53. But 2019 was still the 6th deadliest year for domestic extremist killings since 1970, with 4 of those 6 occurring since 2015. Repeatedly in their assaults, white supremacists weaponize a mythical medieval past with a penchant for so-called Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Celts, Historically problematic terms used to oversimplify earlier ethnic diversity, often to serve racist ends. Such supremacists prioritize racial purity, an imaginary concept by virtually every measure. The ethnic labels used to categorize people, both then and now, are more a matter of convenience than accuracy. England's so-called Norman conquerors of 1066 included Bretons, Flemings, and French, among others. Ireland's 12th century invaders are commonly called Norman or Anglo-Norman in recognition of their century in England, with many intermarrying with the English, although Normans at least initially held England's earlier inhabitants in a contempt similar to what their compatriots would feel centuries later for natives in the Americas. But they often called themselves French as well as English and had so much Welsh blood that they're at times referred to as Cimbro-Normans. They can be called English as they were subjects of the King of England, but a king whose great-grandfather took that throne barely a century earlier and who was himself, as Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine, subject to the King of France, where he was born and raised, where he continued to spend much of his time, and where his holdings rivaled his English kingdom. Scholars see assimilation of the Normans into the English as accomplished within a few generations, but Englishry, a law which recognized two ethnicities in England, the Normans and the English, with a fine to be paid only in the murder of the former, wasn't abolished until 1340. The Irish called Ireland's invaders Saxons, while the invaders themselves recognized their identity's alterity. According to his nephew, Gerald of Wales, 2 years into the invasion, Maurice Fitzgerald exhorted his men to continue it, since they could rely only on themselves, for just as we are regarded as English by the Irish, so we are Irish to the English, and the inhabitants of this island and the other pursue us with equal hatred. Divisions between those remaining in England and those who settled in Ireland continued to fester, revitalized with every new batch of English immigrants to the Irish colony. The 14th century Statute of Kilkenny, which strove to stop English colonists from adopting Irish customs, culture, law, and language, also sought to keep the peace between these two factions, insisting that the English-born in Ireland shouldn't call the English-born in England yokels, while the yokels weren't to call the Irish-born English Irish dog. The 16th and subsequent centuries saw the emergence of an exceptionally virulent form of racism, but racism may be as old as human civilization. In fact, according to moral psychologists like Harvard's Joshua Green, racism partnered with religion may have given rise to civilization. In this theory, religion began as an evolutionary adaptation, a supercharged source of morality created by our minds that enabled humanity to develop group identities, transforming me into we and facilitating collaboration by inventing deities who reward conformity to collective mores or punish deviance, which these theorists saw as an essential step towards civilization. As religion creates a communal we out of many me's, however, it can commonly divide us from several other dehumanized thems. Consequently, quote, our brains are wired for tribalism, end quote. One cloaked with divine power, uniting members of a tribe as it divides that tribe from others with deep and innate prejudice. Thus, religion would be the earliest form of racism, emerging in the dawn of prehistory and playing out in multiple ways in the European Middle Ages, as well as in the modern United States. As the brilliant Audre Lorde notes, however, we do not have to live the same mistakes over again if we can look at them, learn from them, and build upon them. A Black lesbian mother of a son and a daughter, married to a white man and then a white woman, Lorde was acutely aware of how differences get used to divide, exploit, and oppress the marginalized, much as the English relocated lowland Scots to fight their battles against the Irish in 17th century Ulster, a situation that continues into this century with the most severe sectarian violence between primarily Presbyterian loyalists or unionists who want the North to remain in the United Kingdom, and mainly Catholic Republicans or nationalists who want the North to rejoin the rest of the island in the Republic of Ireland. Lorde's wisdom illuminates a path out of these self-defeating patterns so effectively that I quote her at length. We have all been programmed to respond to human differences between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways. Ignore it, and if that's not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. but we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the service of separation and confusion. It is not our differences which separate women, but our reluctance to recognize those differences and to deal effectively with the distortions which have resulted from the ignoring and misnaming of those differences. Our future survival is predicated upon our ability to relate within equality. As women, we must root out internalized patterns of oppression within ourselves if we are to move beyond the most superficial aspects of social change. We have built into all of us old blueprints of expectation and response, old structures of oppression, and these must be altered at the same time as we alter the living conditions which are a result of those structures. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. As Paulo Freire shows so well in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us and which knows only the oppressor's tactics, the oppressor's relationship. This brings us back to fellow poet Seamus Heaney's point about our tribe's complicity. It's easy to point fingers at others, at the soldiers who did the shooting and made that Sunday so bloody, at the government that gave them license to do so, at the IRA who blew Lewis O'Neill to bits, and they do bear a disproportionate burden of the blame. But each one of us helps perpetuate the systems of otherizing that enable such violence, oppression, and persecution to continue. Tribal tendencies exist within each of us, and if certain moral psychologists are right, may have given rise to religion and then civilization itself, creating a communal we out of many me's, which simultaneously became an us differentiated from multiple thems. Essential to that communal self-identity of us are the hated others that form our thems, but neither the us nor the them is static. Groups recycle the same claims with different others, depending on their most recently constructed sense of identity. For example, Protestant paramilitaries, descendants of Scottish settlers given Irish lands in Ulster by the English government following their decisive victory over the Irish in the early 17th century, invoked the Declaration of Arbroath in a recent political mural. The 14th century Scottish text was written to oppose English attempts to dominate Scotland, declaring, "For as long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never under any conditions be subjected to the lordship of the English. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good person loses but with life itself." The 21st century paramilitary Ulster Scots, however, identify the Irish as their enemy, not the English, whom they present as their compatriots. When the English began colonizing non-European peoples in the 16th and subsequent centuries, they drew on their experience in Ireland and reapplied what they learned in these lands back on the Irish. As the Irish themselves emigrated to these lands in large numbers in famine's wake, they faced bigotry and persecution and were, according to Diane Killian of Case Western Reserve University, quote, literally understood as racially Black and thus physically and morally inferior, end quote. By the early 20th century, in what Princeton's Nell Irvin Painter calls, quote, the second great enlargement of American whiteness, end quote, they integrated into a kind of second-class white identity, a fragile sense of belonging shored up by bigotry to get directed at others even farther from a fantasy WASP center, and eventually losing enough perspective that they internalized the identity of their ancestors' oppressors, as seen in Representative Kelly's claim to be an Anglo-Saxon because he is from Ireland. In 1892, Frederick Douglass noted, "Perhaps no class of our fellow citizens has carried this prejudice against color to a point more extreme and dangerous than have our Catholic Irish fellow citizens. And yet no people on the face of the earth have been more relentlessly persecuted and oppressed on account of race and religion than have the same Irish people." Today's white supremacists include many Irish Americans who share Ireland's colonizers' delusions of superiority, repeating not only the sins of the past, but the sins against their own ancestors. The civil rights movement in Northern Ireland was directly inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States, which saw its own Bloody Sunday 7 years earlier, when John Lewis and about 600 other marchers tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, as part of a voting rights campaign. many of whom were badly beaten by police and counter-protesters. Republican in Northern Ireland means someone who wants it to be united with the rest of Ireland and the Irish Republic. And overwhelmingly, such Republicans identify with Black civil rights leaders and other marginalized people around the globe, rather than the powerful people who oppress them, as shown in several of their recent murals. These murals also convey a strong sense of us and them, however, which, as Audre Lorde and Joshua Green remind us, is the root of the problem. Casualty's core question, how culpable was he that last night when he broke our tribe's complicity, raises a more universal one. How culpable are any and all of us for perpetuating our tribe's complicity? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it, individually and collectively? To echo Casualty's next lines, now you're supposed to be an educated audience, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one. As Audre Lorde reminds us, the future not only of humanity, but the earth itself just might depend upon it, but no pressure. Thank you. That is the end of my talk. I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Callan. Very interesting and also very thought-provoking. We will open it up to any questions. At this time, we do have one question that came in during the last portion of your lecture. Were there segregation laws that present themselves in early ruling systems like the English and French monarchies?
So speaking specifically in Ireland, there were things to restrict interaction between those identified as Irish and English. And similarly in England, under the Norman Conquest, there were similar restrictions placed on those who had more of a legitimate claim to being Anglo-Saxon, who are then, when the Normans come over, you could just refer to them as English. But it's not that these things were absolute, and it's not like starting in 1215, Catholics, the papal council required Jews to wear distinctive clothing that would mark them as Jews. So there were things like that were religious, that were supposed to be done throughout Western Christendom. But while there are these laws on the books where that are restricting like getting married, there's one of the things that specifically in Ireland, they tried to restrict intermarriage between the Irish and the English of Ireland, as they get called, or we'd call them Anglo-Irish. But when they are repeating these laws, they're also showing that they're constantly being broken. So the laws might be on the books, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of the experience. And even if you go into, like, for example, Kilkenny was one of the most central cities in the English colony in Ireland, but there's a part of it that's known as Irishtown. And that's where like the native Irish people would live in that particular community. So yes, there were policies that were on the books in various forms. There were also lots of customs that would regulate that, but those things were also broken repeatedly in all sorts of ways. So it wasn't an absolute kind of thing.
Dr. Callan, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to all of our guests for tuning in as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving.